Hey guys, I apologize for the tinny microphone, but I want to throw up the rest of the review slides from lecture today. We didn't finish this one slide in the protein section. After we talked about weight control, we also talked about some specific situations when protein might be a concern or there might be an added requirement. Generally, we want to keep ourselves in nitrogen balance and offset the amount of protein coming in with the protein that we are breaking down and excreting. So it's not needed, extra protein's not needed for average individuals, but there are enhanced requirements with sports like resistance exercise, where protein supplementation may be, and even more than that, is something to consider in order to sustain muscle growth. Similarly, in vegetarian diets, the requirements aren't increased, but there tends to be a reduced supply of protein for vegetarians. It's either not as bioavailable, and so the protein that is ingested isn't being put to use towards making enzymes or sustaining muscle, in which case vegetarians, depending on the type, should increase protein intake by around 10%. Or the lack of foods that contain protein also result in deficiencies of some micronutrients. So some specific micronutrients, those that tend to also be associated with high protein foods, red meat, etc. Calcium from milk, B12 and iron from red meat. So those are some considerations for protein and the related vitamins in special situations. Now, we talked about micronutrients, and I mentioned in class that I don't want you guys just to memorize a list and rhyme off this, that, and the other thing with respect to one micronutrient. I want you guys to think about the material and understand it, and not just be a dictionary. So, to understand micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals, we have to understand that we didn't know about them for the longest time, and only recently have we found that these deficiencies in specific micronutrients, cause severe diseases. And we talked about some of those diseases, certainly in the examples, and then highlighted by you guys in class, which leads us to, overall, in general, a more is better mentality that might be misguided, considering that there isn't a lot of research on toxicity and upper limits to vitamin and mineral intake. We have this general guideline that anything over 2 to 3 times the RDA is typically a cause for concern, something that we shouldn't surpass. But certainly these do effectively treat these deficiency diseases, and so by natural extension we assume as fallible people that more is better. Now, we need vitamins and minerals to mainly facilitate reactions. They are required in metabolism for it to carry on. They're required as coenzymes, which are things that participate in a reaction. They make the substrate fit with the enzyme. They're involved in the process. And cofactors are those factors that are required to be present. They allow the reactions to move forward, but they don't change how the components interact. So magnesium in contraction is an example of a cofactor. It has to be there in order for the reaction to happen, but it's not required in the process, in the reaction carried out by the myosin molecule. Now, these have widespread roles throughout metabolism, and for energy metabolism specifically, we've acknowledged that vitamins, minerals fulfill the roles of being part of and allowing high-energy compounds to exist. Thiamine pyrophosphate is a high-energy compound that facilitates reactions. And then niacin, for example, is a molecule that is involved in electron shuttling, moving electrons around, which is one of the main goals of metabolism, certainly in the muscle and other active tissues. So they have key roles in facilitating this flow of energy, the flow of electrons from food in the muscle and the fat and the liver, etc. You can see that outlined here. We talked about niacin. Riboflavin is similar in that it helps with shuttling electrons, and you can see thiamine sitting below pyruvate before the TCA cycle at kind of a nexus where carbohydrates enter the mitochondria, enter metabolism. Without thiamine, that entry is prevented somewhat, certainly reduced. We moved on to fluids next and discussed how and why fluids and electrolytes are so important. The distribution of fluid around the body follows the 60-40-20 rule, where 60% of the body is fluid, 40% is intracellular, inside the cells, and then 20% of body fluid is outside the cells. That fluid outside the cells is further split into interstitial and intravascular. Interstitial is the blue portion on the diagram to the right. That's the fluid between cells. It's the medium that the cells sit in. And then the intravascular fluid is plasma, not the red portion of blood, which is red blood cells. Those are still cells, but the intravascular fluid is the clear liquid that makes up the bulk of the fluid, that carries red blood cells and solutes and everything throughout the body. That fluid is mostly made of water, and we often use water and fluid interchangeably, but the key difference with body fluid is that it also contains solutes, the ionized form of electrolytes. These are mineral salts. They're dissolved in water because water is an excellent solvent. The charged particles are then partitioned into different parts of the body. They have specific roles, and they're supposed to be separated that way because it allows some imbalances to be created, which we then harness in order to make energy or accomplish work. Now, we want a certain amount of water and a certain concentration of electrolytes in the body, and if we have this, we're happy. If we don't have this, then we try to get back to this happy medium. We don't want to be low on body water. We don't want to have concentrated body fluids. We want to maintain homeostasis. And we've evolved a hierarchy of different responses, hormonal and neural responses that allow us to act to maintain homeostasis. That might involve getting rid of some electrolytes in the fluid if we find that we are too concentrated, or maybe the fluids are too concentrated because we've lost water, and so the signals would then tell us to retain water. So it's the combination of all these signals working together that dictate what exactly the problem is and help us get back to homeostasis. Now, on the far left is the situation that we would like to be in. Everything is normal. The concentration throughout, inside the cell and outside, is constant or is equal. And we want to establish this balance. We want to keep homeostasis. Whenever something happens to pull us away from that, the body adjusts. And normally on the short term, fluid, water, moves in order to adjust the concentration, in order to balance out the concentration of ions. So the middle panel it's hard to imagine because we can't often load cells with ions. But if you think about it as ions being removed from outside the cell, it's the same kind of imbalance. Now the cell is more concentrated than the fluid around the cell, which is the case with hyponatremia. And so the reaction here is for water to be pulled in. The ions inside the cell pull water into the cell, and you can see the cell here expanding. When this happens in brain cells, this is a particular concern because there's no room for these cells to expand. And then on the other hand, when the concentration of fluids outside the cell is higher than inside, water moves out of the cell to balance the concentration across the membrane. This happens to a certain extent in dehydration, but not to the same extent where it is fatal as with hyponatremia in the middle. So we always want to balance fluid and balance electrolytes. This slide is an amalgamation of those two ideas. We've talked about fluid and electrolytes separately in the lecture. In this slide, I'm alluding to both fluid or water and electrolytes. And so on the left-hand side, we have the intake, the production of water and of electrolytes. And the majority of these come from food and from drinks. We can't get water and electrolytes from many other places. We can only produce water metabolically in very small amounts when we reduce oxygen to water at the end of the ETC. But we don't produce electrolytes anywhere else. We have to get, and we get the majority of both of these from foods that we ingest. Now, in order to balance those, to excrete them, if we ever have a surplus, this is accomplished largely by the kidneys in response to the hormones that we talked about, angiotensinogen, angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, renin, etc. The kidney responds to these hormones and then filters water. It can filter sodium or it can filter potassium if it gets that signal. And this will account for the largest portion of these losses, the output on the other half of this balance. But we do also have some insensible losses, things that we don't normally account for that don't happen in very large quantities. Water and electrolytes are both lost in sweat and in feces to some extent, but only water is lost through the breath. We don't get rid of many electrolytes in the humid air that we exhale. So these generally are quite small, and for our purposes, we can assume that these balance with the metabolic water production. This diagram highlights the input to the kidney, highlighting that there are many different inputs. It's a wide, comprehensive, multi-tissue response. There's many layers. It's not just one hormone that will turn the whole system on or off. Each hormone has a slightly different effect, and the combination of these hormones dictates, well, do we need to get rid of fluid and sodium? Do we need to just get rid of fluid? Do we need to retain sodium? And so I won't go through this in detail. I will let you guys look through this, but suffice it to say that it is a hierarchy that's tightly regulated and involves many different tissues in the body in order to accurately balance fluid and electrolyte losses. When we get an imbalance, and this is one example of imbalance, hyponatremia for instance, some severe side effects can happen. The appearance of hyponatremia normally occurs when an individual drinks too much fluid and not enough electrolytes, which dilutes the fluid outside of the cell. Like in that cartoon that we saw, fluid would then serve to rush into the cell to balance the concentration on both sides. This happens acutely because typically we don't have a lot of time we can't respond with the kidneys to filter out electrolytes and fluid that quickly. And this is made even worse during exercise when the kidneys aren't working as hard. Blood doesn't flow to the kidneys in as large a volume during exercise, and so our ability to filter out fluid and to filter out electrolytes is compromised. So this is why we see this more and more in situations like marathon running when consuming water or really dilute fluids. Again, the complications seem to be some combination of headaches, confusion, seizures, dizziness that could eventually lead to coma and death. I say could, it's very unlikely. It takes very regimented, strict, almost uncomfortable drinking. Drinking to the point where you don't want to, but you're driven because you've heard that it was good for you. This kind of forced drinking that might result in hyponatremia or an imbalance like this. Certainly, if you were to overdrink water while not exercising, these complications and the severity of hyponatremia would be a lot less. It would be reduced because our kidneys would be able to function optimally and get rid of that fluid and electrolytes. And so I think that is it. You can't ask me any questions now, at least through this video, but I welcome you to send me an email, stop by office hours, Call me in my office, whatever you have to do, with any last-minute questions that you have. The exam is looking to be in the 40 multiple choice question range. It's slightly more than last time, but I think that you guys handled the first one fairly well. And I'm looking at 2 short answers, possibly with a bonus, but likely not. Very similar overall in design to the first one, but that will be finalized tomorrow. So give me any questions that you have. Otherwise, good luck studying, and I'll see you on Friday.